West Virginia at Marshall, Friday night, ESPN. Marco, what should sports bettors be thinking about?
This is a rivalry game, but it's a rivalry game that means more to one of the two participants, and that would be Marshall.
Though you grew up in West Virginia, right?
No.
Very close.
About as close as you. Actually, you're closer.
The Marshall was in West Virginia. For some that don't know that, which, like you said, is the rivalry. The smaller school, this is a big deal to them. I think as you dig a little deeper into this game, a couple key factors really jump out. One is the Marshall coach, Doc Holliday, was the associate head coach at West Virginia last year. So typically in those spots, what is that? If you have a coach that was with the program as an assistant and then moves on to be a head coach somewhere else, what effect does that have on your handicap?
To me, I would look at it as, he left there on good terms and everything, that they're not going to really want to run the score up on him.
Which, if the point spread was 24, 28 plus, that would be a valid point. Clearly less than 2 touchdowns. West Virginia is going to be trying to score to get it past 2 touchdowns at any point in the fourth quarter, just for safety's sake to win the game.
There is, but there's also, you don't have to necessarily, when you talk about running up the score, the margin of victory, but the tempo of the game too. And
I disagree. You're never ever going to not want to be up 2 touchdowns. So, you're going to say, we're a 13-point favorite. Let's slow it down in the first quarter so we don't kill them. That's what Marshall's going to be trying to do, slow it down so there's less possessions because they're a weaker team. So the idea, you're a touchy-feely guy, and I mean, all joking aside, is there's jobs on the line with these people. And I can promise you West Virginia is going to try the only time running up ever matters is in the fourth quarter, up by 21 or more. Are you throwing or aren't you throwing? Do you have your second stringer or don't you? And there's no scenario where the point spread is going to be affected by that with a 13-point spread.
Well, what I was going to say, and if I'll say it now, is that when Rodriguez was at West Virginia, this series was very high scoring. The 2 games that they've played since Rodriguez has left under this coaching regime, both of the games were West Virginia scored in the 20s and Marshall was in single digits. So it was a different complexion of a game. Looking statistically.
Except Doc Holliday was with West Virginia last year.
He was.
So what we're talking about isn't necessarily how these teams match up, or I don't think any real handicap is, well, how did the teams do against each other last year? Because clearly the question is, how many returning starters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my takeaway is this: with a different point spread, that affiliation between the Marshall coach and West Virginia might be meaningful. At this point spread, it's not going to be when it comes to motivation. But it might be when it comes to being familiar with the program, that Doc Holliday is going to be very familiar with West Virginia and the way they do things, their weaknesses, their strengths. I got to say that's a big red thumbs up on the Marshall side when it comes to that coaching relationship.
I agree with you.
That's all sometimes you can just say, I agree.
Yeah, well, I was going to bring up a point that you made last week when we talked about Ohio State, and I think that going to, the current West Virginia coach, that might be a possible philosophy with the scoring. Remember you said about Ohio State when they played Ohio, that, football's big in Ohio and the Jim Tressel.
Exactly. So the point I made last week was they aren't going to want to beat up on an in-state school, especially one that's overmatched. But again, this is a 2-touchdown game. I mean, this isn't much more of a Miami, Ohio State is, what's the line in that game? 9?
8.5, yeah.
All right. This line is 4 points different. Is anyone saying, I wonder if Tressel's going to run it up?
Yeah, but it's difference 4 points of the line, but there's a difference. West Virginia's on the road, so West Virginia clearly, if they were playing at home, would be 3 touchdowns.
But the thing is, being on the road is going to affect their ability to dominate the game. So it's not just a choice. It's not like playing with your 7th grade, when you're a senior with your 7th grade brother playing basketball. Okay, a couple other points I think are really good. Here's the negative to Marshall, which is they did play Ohio State last week. And I can tell you from my coaching relationships is when a small school plays a monster, they physically feel it the next week. They're getting beat up like back to the little brother. It's like the senior beating up on the seventh grader. Physically, they're not used to this in practice or anything. So they're really, really most likely affected by that. It's going to take more than a week to get over that. That's a negative for Marshall. Number two, Ohio State went so vanilla, as they always do early in the year, and we talked about in our Ohio State betting preview video, is the score is likely less extreme than it could have been. And actually, Marshall had a special teams touchdown, which made the score look closer. So I don't think this Marshall team is quite as good as people think, based on the Ohio State game not being a total domination.
The only thing that I found interesting with what Vegas did that gave me a little bit of pause on this game is the fact that they did bring this out, and you keep touching about the 13, is as dominant as West Virginia looks on paper and as bad as Marshall looked last week, would you have thought any different if they'd have brought this out at the full 2 touchdowns?
No, if anything, it seems a little short.
And
it seems like the value's on West Virginia.
It does. That's the only thing that gives me pause of not really pulling the trigger on West Virginia. Because when I see that...
You think the bookies are trying to induce you into laying the 13?
Yes.
Which means you want to take the 13.
Yeah. Handicap-wise, I actually have it as a 14-point game. I have West Virginia winning by 14, 27-13.
All right, so you have an official projection on this game.
West Virginia, 27-13. So you're going to have to watch the lines, value here. If you're still getting West Virginia at 13 on Saturday, then West Virginia, I'll go ahead and give you the buy sign.
So really, even with that 1 point difference, 14 off of 13, you'd be betting this at 13.
Yes.
Wow, so that's interesting. But though you think it's going to be a 14-point game.
This game is just, it's about value.
Small
where
play,
it's going to fall.
small play.
This is just an opinion, yes.
This isn't when Marco gets the rubber band.
No, the rubber band is doubled up right now.
Okay, this is when it's your turn to get involved. You can continue the conversation in the comment section with me and Marco. And in the next segment, we're going to be talking about weekend college football and NFL action.